On this episode of the Young Pioneer Podcast, we're flipping the script on a man who's usually asking us the tough questions. That's CNN's Senior International Correspondent, Will Ripley. Both Will and I are Americans navigating the unique landscape of North Korea. And today, we're going behind the scenes on his reporting, and we'll dive into his experiences, insights, and the fascinating stories he's gathered while covering one of the most enigmatic countries in the world. I'm your host, Justin Martell, and this is the Young Pioneer Podcast.
자선주왕 방송입니다.
All right, so welcome to today's episode of the Young Pioneer Podcast. We're very excited to have Will Ripley on the podcast today. Will Ripley is an award-winning journalist who has been based across Asia in Tokyo, Hong Kong, and currently Taipei. Since 2014, Will has reported extensively on North Korea. His work has provided deep insights into the country's political landscape, human rights issues, and the impact of international sanctions. Ripley has traveled to North Korea 19 times since 2014, more than any other American correspondent, and actually more than me, I would add. So he's gained unique access to the Hermit Kingdom, which has allowed him to report on various aspects of life there, including the economy, culture, and the government's influence on its citizens. Will's reporting often highlights the stark contrast between the narratives presented by the North Korean government and the realities faced by its people. He has covered significant events such as nuclear tests, diplomatic relations, and the dynamics of the Kim family's rule, helping to contextualize North Korea within a broader geopolitical context. His dedication to shedding new light on a country known for its secrecy has made him a notable figure in the field of North Korean studies, bringing attention to the challenges faced by the North Korean population and the complexities of engaging with its government. Will, thank you very much for being on the Young Pioneer Podcast.
Hey, Justin, it's good to be with you. And I've been to North Korea 19 times, but you have beat me because you're the first American in after the pandemic. So you actually win, I think.
That's true, and I think that helps sort of bring our listeners up to date. Will, of course, covered the return of Western tourists, I should say the brief return of Western tourists to North Korea in Rason last month. And yes, I was the first American to enter post-COVID. And I must say, it was, as we discussed, Will, it was a lot like it was pre-COVID in many ways, and there were a few differences. But I also wanted to point out, Will and I both grew up in Connecticut. I grew up in Norwich, Connecticut, but my parents did live for a time in Manchester, which I think is where you're living.
That's right. Wow. Okay. The small world. And here we are. You're in the Philippines right now, right?
Yeah, and you're in Taipei, so we've ended up on the same time zone as luck would have it, so that's good. I've got some questions prepared, and I know you're a busy man, and there is a news cycle happening that you've got to cover, so let's jump right into it.
All right.
You've said that with each of your 19 visits to North Korea, you've managed to open the door a little more. And what are the key factors that have contributed to increasing access and understanding of the secret state as you described in your 2018 documentary?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're a first-time visitor to North Korea, you can get distracted or caught up with all of these preconceived notions in your head about what it's like there, and are you under surveillance, which you probably are, and you're worried about a lot of things, and you have all of these ideas in your head that can cloud your experience. Whereas, like, when you've been there a bunch of times, as you know, you start to just talk to people in a little more of a candid and perhaps relatable way, although there's always going to be a boundary between you and locals that you have a conversation with, just given the nature that you're a foreigner. And they probably will have to be questioned after their conversation with you about what was discussed. So there's a lot more stakes for them they can't really let their guard down and just speak entirely freely to an outsider. But the more times you go, I think you have more opportunities to just observe and maybe free your mind of some of the things that you thought about North Korea and just instead focus on what you see. And what you see really is people that, despite a very different system than what they're used to, they're living their everyday lives, and they laugh and they tell jokes, and they have aspirations for their families and to have a better life. I mean, a lot of common ground you can find, I think, the more time you spend in North Korea and talk to the people there.
Yeah, and that's an important thing that I think has come across in your reporting, and that also we highlight with our work in the tourism industry, is humanizing North Korea, which of course I think is a very important thing, especially when you're dealing with much heavier issues such as the prospect of nuclear war and things of that nature. And so it's important to keep that human element and interaction. I want to back up a little bit and talk about your first trip to North Korea. Now, I think it was in 2014, and you were based in Tokyo at the time. And I think you went to cover a sponsored wrestling event, right?
That's right. I mean, we went in with a group of sports journalists, got the visa in Japan. I was new to CNN, and there were a lot of people in line before me with more seniority to get into North Korea, but we were able to secure a visa from Japan. And so our terrific boss, the senior vice president and managing editor for Asia Pacific, Elena Lee, she green-lighted me going, kind of skipping the queue over more senior correspondents that wanted to go or even had been there before. So it was really a lucky break for me to be able to go on this trip. And it was a lot of feature reporting and sightseeing. Elena, my boss, suggested that we put in a request after arriving to speak with the 3 Americans who were detained there at that time. Kenneth Bay, who'd been there the longest, and also 2 recently detained Americans, Jeffrey Fowle and Matthew Miller. I thought it was a long shot, that there was no way that this country would allow us to speak with people that were being held. But we put in the request anyway and didn't really think much about it until the second to the last day that we were there. And we were actually on another sightseeing trip more than an hour outside of Pyongyang, and I was pulled out of a group event, pulled out of a lunch, and brought into a van with no explanation and driven back towards the capital. And people were having conversations on their cell phones. The minders that we were with, I didn't know what was happening. It was actually quite nerve-wracking. We arrived at a pretty nondescript building in Pyongyang, and there was a military officer there waiting for us who said that we could speak to the 3 of them. Our request had been granted, but we'd only have 5 minutes with each of them. We had to stick with pre-agreed framework for questioning, and if we veered outside of that, there was a chance that we wouldn't make our flight home the next day. And then it was basically roll camera, 3, 2, 1, go. And we walked from room to room and did those interviews. I was really nervous. Looking back, I feel like I probably would have handled that situation differently with the way that I interviewed them, but I was so focused at that time on just not breaking any of the rules that were put out before us. And so I just asked these 3 questions along the guidelines that were agreed with the North Koreans. And there were probably about 20 North Koreans in the room watching us and filming us as we did this. So it was nerve-wracking to say the least. But in the end, the report went out. It was breaking news. It basically dominated the news cycle on CNN that day. I think it was like Labor Day in the U.S. When this reporting went out. And I remember one of our anchors actually reached out to me after the coverage and just said, "Congratulations, this is a moment that will reshape your career as you know it." And she was right. It really, that moment was when everything kind of changed. The North Koreans, I think, felt that we did a credible job. We kept to our word. We did get on our flight and leave the country as scheduled. It was an exclusive that was given to us, and that opened the door for future visits, which began in the coming months and years. And we were going in quite a lot, especially during 2017 when things were escalating with President Trump at that time.
And bring me back before going to North Korea on that first trip. Yeah, what was the process like for applying for a journalist visa from Japan? Did you deal with the Chongron Association in Japan? Was that?
We did. Yeah. At that time, they were authorized to allow us to get in. That's now no longer the case. It's not possible to get a visa through them anymore. But they were even having a hard time getting visas. Even as the country was slowly reopening after COVID, it was difficult for even those folks to get visas. So it was a different ball game more than a decade ago. And it was still difficult for Americans to get in, but it's even more difficult now, which is why you had to get your second passport.
Yes, and we'll come back to that because I do want to actually ask you some questions about traveling to North Korea as a journalist, obviously after the travel ban, but I have that later in my questions. Okay, so obviously, you kept your word with the Koreans. They gave you guidelines for interviewing these detainees, and I think everybody walked away, I guess, satisfied with the coverage. Did you reach out about coming back, and how receptive were the North Koreans after that initial trip?
Before going on my first trip, I watched a lot of other reports. Basically, I watched everything I could that had been done in North Korea by journalists. And one kind of consistent theme that I saw that people had done was to get an on-camera confrontation with a minder, trying to fight for access to something, and just that would create a dramatic moment in a story. But for me, I felt like that's also kind of a way to burn bridges and to guarantee you're not going to get an invitation back. So I tried to take the opposite approach. I wasn't confrontational. I was polite, tried to go in as a blank slate and have an open mind, even though I was obviously raised with a very different set of beliefs as growing up in the U.S. than what they were raised with in North Korea. And I was transparent about that. But I said, I'm here, to visit your country and to learn. And I gave my business card out, which included my email address, to every official and person that I encountered. I just brought a ton of business cards and handed them out, not necessarily expecting that anybody would ever be able to contact me, because we know that internet access is almost non-existent except for really privileged elite in North Korea, and also outside visitors who can afford to pay big bucks to get it. But a number of months later, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize, and it turned out to be our North Korean counterparts, and that started the conversation for our next trip and subsequent trips.
Okay, so they reached out to you. That's very interesting. And can you, sort of talk us through the process of visiting North Korea as a journalist, just from, and obviously some of this might be proprietary, but I understand, it's going to be a little different for you as a journalist than for me working in the tourism sector. I'm working with the Korean International Travel Company and various other local travel companies. Who are you interfacing with? Like, what government department?
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the gatekeeper for most foreign journalist delegations, because they would be the ones that would then communicate with higher levels of government about whether news organizations should be allowed access. I think the North Koreans need to feel that there's a benefit to their nation and their national interest by having journalists come. So whether they want to show off something, whether they have a message that they want to relay, whether they're hoping that the broadcast would be seen by influential policymakers, which, with a network like CNN and the audience that we have, especially in, the upper levels of government around the world, there could be an obvious advantage for them to use a news organization to get their message out in a way that's translated for a Western audience, but still obviously important to them that their leadership is respected and that their system is respected, and that they're not being treated like a joke, like some of the coverage used to do more than a decade ago. I think now they've become much more savvy, and news organizations have become much more savvy in the way they cover North Korea, especially Kim Jong-un's got a lot of legitimacy after the period of diplomacy with President Trump. And other world leaders, and so now North Korea is covered in a way much like other countries and less like the butt of a joke that it was in the past. The kind of low-hanging fruit stories that could never really be verified, that were questionable whether they're even true. And now also North Korean state media does a much better job about quickly getting their information out, getting pictures and video out of things like weapons tests and other military parades. And so, and even the quality of their videography, I think, has improved. I think they observed the way that Western news organizations reported in the country, and they've now embraced things like close-ups in video, which they never used to do, because they thought that close-ups were zooming in too uncomfortably close on details that they didn't necessarily want. And now they understand that close-ups are a way to bring the viewer closer to the story. So I'm not sure that the North Koreans have caught on fully yet to the phenomenon of social media influencers. And I know that, it's kind of an open question whether tourism will resume. I do wonder if they kind of realize that a lot of influencers might be booking vacations into North Korea, and these influencers have massive audiences. Maybe that's a reason why there's been a pause in the tourism, Western tourism to Rason, or why they haven't opened up Pyongyang yet. Who knows? But I certainly am hopeful that the North Koreans will continue to see a benefit for inviting news organizations into the country, because I do think that we bring a perspective that influencers might not necessarily bring, although I do think that some of the content that was produced during the trips, the recent trips to North Korea, was really interesting. And of course, I'm watching all of it because that's what I do. Even though I haven't been in the country in a number of years, I'm a North Korea nerd, and I'm constantly reading and watching and studying everything that I can because it's just a fascinating place, even when you're covering it from afar.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think you brought up an important point that what you do, obviously, as a senior correspondent and journalist is pretty far off from what the content creators and influencers do. But we are, it's just really interesting because obviously North Korea closed in January of 2020 because of the pandemic. It's been 5 years. And during that time, we've seen, for better or for worse, something of a blur between your sort of traditional mainstream news outlets and then people who get a lot of their information from these content creators, whether they be travel content creators or, focusing on other topics. We had, I think the groups were, I would say 80 to 90% content creators with various levels of following. And I thought one of the best ones was Mike O'Kennedy, especially in his second part of his video, did a really good job of sort of balancing, what people want to see from a content creator, like, oh my God, this is North Korea, it's the weirdest place in the world, with also talking about the human side and, human connection that you can experience when visiting North Korea. And I thought that was quite good.
And the frustration for someone like Mike, who I'm a big fan of his work. This is the guy who's hitchhiked through sensitive areas of China. Mike's never going to have a chance to do that sort of content creating in North Korea. And I think being under heavy supervision was probably frustrating for him. But, like all of us who visit the country do, we try to do our best to glimpse as much of an authentic picture as we can, given the restrictions.
Bring us back around to the topic of covering North Korea and avoiding those low-hanging fruit stories. Like, it's interesting how there's certain journalistic standards that really aren't upheld when talking about North Korea. Oftentimes, if a mainstream news outlet gets something wrong, they're not really obligated to issue any sort of redaction or update to the story, such as, there are only however many approved haircuts or, whatever it may be. But your predecessor, Mike Chinoy, I was also a big fan of his work, and he wrote a very good book called Meltdown, which detailed the Bush administration's dismantling of the agreed framework that had been set up between the Clinton administration and Kim Jong-il. Did you read any of his coverage or read his book, Meltdown, prior to visiting North Korea or after?
Yeah, and I've also, Mike's a friend, and he actually lives here in Taiwan now, so I saw him not too long ago. He's made 17 trips, so he's right up there with visits. And Mike has the distinction, along with our former producer, Tim Schwartz, of meeting Kim Il-sung shortly before his death. They had, I believe, lunch with him. They were obviously there also when Jimmy Carter was in North Korea, and Jimmy Carter broke the news. The late former president, broke the news on CNN about his negotiations, and in fact relayed the information to the Clinton White House on CNN, live from North Korea. So Mike was on hand for some truly historic moments, and he's been the closest, I believe, of anyone at CNN to the North Korean leadership, and not just anyone, but the founding president, the eternal president, Kim Il-sung. So his perspective is just fantastic. His books are fantastic. His films are fantastic. And I have a lot of respect for Mike. And I think he could be the first to tell you that the United States has and maybe it's because of the inconsistencies between presidential administrations. North Korea, when you have a ruler with absolute power, and the three generations of the same family that have been in power for so many decades, they can strategize and come up with a plan and stick with it consistently. Whereas in the U.S., it's, every 4 or 8 years, things can change dramatically. And so there have been a number of examples where things have been negotiated and agreed upon and then drastically changed. And I think the North Koreans over time have just developed a massive distrust for any sort of negotiations with the United States, and especially Kim Jong-un, who really went out, on a limb, particularly before the Hanoi summit with President Trump, where they actually told people about this meeting before it even happened, and they showed footage of Kim on the train, and he traveled all of that distance to go to Hanoi, only to be left not only with no deal, but the embarrassment of Trump essentially walking out and them not even having lunch together. The loss of face, the humiliation, the anger. I believe that even though North Korea probably is still interested in capitalizing on the personal relationship between Trump and Kim, there's certainly not trust there. There's not any trust there that the United States can actually come through. And I certainly believe, and according to a lot of folks I've talked to, that any prospect of denuclearization is now a non-starter, totally off the table. They look at what happens to countries that give up their nuclear weapons, and it's not anything good from their perspective. And so I think they look at the nukes as essential to their survival. And so any talks with the U.S., with President Trump or anyone else, and it would have to be at a high level because they've already had leader-to-leader conversations, they wouldn't involve denuclearization, but maybe some other sort of limiting of nuclear arsenal buildup or other things could be on the table. But I think the nukes are here to stay, and there's deep suspicion about whether the United States would actually follow through on any agreement. I think there were a lot of opportunities over the years, and I think that ship has now sailed. And I think that North Korea will only be willing to be accepted as a nuclear weapons state in some way, as other countries have over history, because that arsenal is not going anywhere.
Yeah, and I agree completely. I mean, it's I had some very interesting discussions with our North Korean guides in Rason about this topic, because obviously, of course, they were aware of that Donald Trump is the next president, or that he's been reelected, and they, of course, were aware of his previous meetings and sort of warm relationship with Kim Jong-un. But North Korean state media has been pretty clear that feelings. I think they issued a statement to the effect of personal feelings are one thing, politics are another. And so, of course, the North Koreans were sort of parroting that line. But I did fill in some information for them, such as President Trump acknowledging North Korea as a nuclear power, pretty much on his first day in office. Tulsi Gabbard calling for risk reduction with North Korea. So everything does kind of point to the Trump administration, if there are renewed talks, moving away from CVID, which I think is, been the thing that's kind of derailed any, significant progress, in terms of U.S. North Korea relations, or even North Korea relations with the West in general, and also has led us to a nuclear armed or more nuclear advanced North Korea. And the other thing too, with what you're saying is, I think in terms of partisan politics, people like to play games with. You had President Clinton in the twilight of his administration under the assumption that Al Gore was going to win the next election, make these deals with Kim Jong-il, and he sent over Madeleine Albright, and he was, going to visit himself. Then you had the Bush administration come and completely dismantle that agreed framework. And you had the Republicans during that time saying President Clinton was cozying up to a dictator, and then fast forward to the Trump administration, and you had the Democrats basically saying the same thing. And you, again, say what you want about President Clinton, say what you want about President Trump. But I think, from our perspective, we could agree that, engagement is probably the most sensible thing, regardless of whether it was a Republican or a Democratic administration. So it's unfortunate it's become kind of an issue that people can play partisan politics with.
Yeah, I think we've seen lawmakers do pretty startling about-face on topics that they might have argued against many years ago and now are supporting. That's a whole other, you can spend hours just talking about that. But yeah, when it comes to North Korea, I think a lot of observers would agree that one of the big, I don't know if you want to say mistakes, but one of the policies of the Biden administration that, resuming the strategic patience of the Obama years, it just seemed like North Korea was not at all a priority for President Biden. And as a result, there was just no headway made at all. And in fact, there was a flurry of weapons tests. And the country was basically unafraid of sanctions because they're already so heavily sanctioned, and they had the Russian and Chinese veto power in the UN. I think what's changed now is you also have the United States in the UN voting in ways that it would have been unheard of before. So, it's an interesting time. I think that President Trump obviously has Ukraine on his radar right now. There's also China and Taiwan, and all the stuff bubbling in this region. But I do think that North Korea and his relationship with Kim continues to be one of his proudest achievements from the first term, and I think he'd like to find a way to build on that, whether it would mean a summit in North Korea. Maybe they go to the new hotel complex in Wonsan that's been just finished with all of those fancy, international grade meeting facilities and hundreds of new hotel rooms. Wonsan's a beautiful place. I mean, I'd love to see those hotels. I saw them when they were under construction. I'd love to see how they look now. It's some gorgeous waterfront, and I'm sure Kim's quite proud that they were able to finish that even during the pandemic and despite all the sanctions. But yeah, who knows? I mean, it'll be really interesting to see how things unfold in the coming few years in terms of diplomacy between the U.S. and North Korea, and whether that would still be a priority for President Trump, and whether the North Koreans could see an opportunity that they probably wouldn't see with almost any other U.S. leader in history.
Absolutely, and I think, what a big determining factor is going to be these discussions between President Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Zelensky, and what happens in Ukraine. And of course, North Korea factors into it. And I want to come back to that question, but let's go back to your coverage, and because we're kind of going down this rabbit hole of
we could get in many rabbit holes.
Yeah, geopolitics and all that, but. I want to come back to your coverage of North Korea. So in your 2018 documentary, North Korea's Secret State, there's a very interesting moment right in the beginning where you go up to a group of boys and they're playing an arcade game and they're shooting Americans. And you ask them if they would, since you're American, would they shoot you too? And I think it really highlights the dualities of North Korea, where, even these young boys said to you something that I've had North Korean adults say to me, where they say, well, yeah, you're American, but you're here and you're friendly, and we can recognize the difference between you as a person and the policy of the American government. And can you elaborate on that interaction? And there's a moment where you're having that conversation, and there's a quick shot of where you can see a hand tugging on your shoulder, and I wanted to know if that was your guide trying to steer the conversation along or move you along.
Oh gosh, it might have been. It might have been my cameraman just wanting me to change positions so he could get a better shot. I mean, it was kind of a tight squeeze. I don't specifically remember why or who. It's interesting. I mean, you that's an interesting detail that you noticed. I probably don't think I even noticed that myself. But I do recall that conversation, and I don't think that the North Korean guides were uncomfortable with us asking those questions. I mean, those kids, they gave an entirely correct answer from the North Korean perspective. This is our enemy. These are the Americans. This is who we're shooting. And when I said, "Oh, I'm an American too," I mean, maybe they were expecting somebody that looked a little more sinister or had a bigger, a big scary nose. I think they said Americans have big noses and hairy chests. Or these were high school students, I think, that said that to me. They have this kind of this caricature of an American in their mind, and maybe I didn't quite fit that, which is why they then said, if you're a good American, then we won't shoot you. We'll let you live. I mean, the kids were adorable. They're polite. They're charming. And this is, I think that North Korean people, by and large, are just delightful people. They're kind. They're sheltered in some ways from a lot of things in the world because of the severe restrictions on the information that they get. So their view is, you almost might use the word innocent in a way, because their government will say that the reason why there's all this censorship is they're protecting them from this yellow foreign influence that's so corrupting. And we can have a conversation about whether it's a good or bad thing for North Korea that outside social media like Facebook was never allowed in. I think certainly my perspective on that, given what we're experiencing now in the world with all of these alternate realities and disinformation running rampant, who knows if they certainly don't have that problem in North Korea because the information is tightly controlled. Whether that information is accurate or correct, or whether you agree with that, it's probably a much more unified society, because they really don't have a choice. They have to fall in line under the views of the leadership. That's just a requirement to be a part of that society in good standing. But the people themselves are delightful, the children and the adults. And even if there is some suspicion about Americans, it certainly I mean, the only thing I would say is, as an American, you have to be extra conscientious of making sure you're following all the rules. And, don't whip out your cell phone and take pictures when you're on the road approaching a military checkpoint. That would be pretty stupid. You could be accused of spying for doing that. But that could also be the case in other countries, too. So just follow the rules. And as an American, be particularly aware that you're going to be watched, and there could be suspicion towards your motives for being there. So you just have to make an even extra effort to be respectful and compliant with the laws and procedures.
And, I wanted to ask you, because you have taken this more nuanced perspective in your reporting and avoiding sensationalism that, characterizes much of the media coverage of North Korea, I've seen way more abject poverty in other places in the world.
In the Philippines, where you are right now, I've seen far worse housing situations than I've ever witnessed personally in North Korea.
Absolutely. Even in, the more, we've both been out to remote farming villages and things like that in North Korea. And I've seen way worse scenes, but it's like, it's everybody wants to see those scenes. But it kind of, I guess my question is, have you received any pushback for avoiding the low-hanging fruit?
Well, no. I mean, I'm sure that there are some who would argue that what we've done in North Korea is, falls under the definition of access journalism, where, if you want to get access, you have to play by a certain set of rules. And to an extent, that's true. If you want to be invited into the country by a government, you do have to respect the rules of that government. I guess one of the advantages of going in, on a tourism trip, if there are people that have gone in as, who are journalists, but kind of undercover journalists that go in on a tourist trip and then shoot this, this program that's framed as an expose, and they, are trying to, whether or not they're actually seeing anything that's worthy of exposing, or whether that, this is just, they're doing it to kind of get attention and clicks. I mean, that's it depends on the content. It depends on the angle. I mean, going back to Mikey, who you brought in, I thought he did a great job. I mean, that was a really interesting program, and that's the way to cover, to do a travel program in North Korea. But there are others that have gone in and try, you see the headline on YouTube, it's some, sensational whatever. Look, I think that we do cover North Korea very critically. And as long as that criticism is backed up by facts, I think the North Koreans might not be necessarily happy about it, but they understand and respect that the reporting is fair. I mean, we're not doing fluff pieces about how great it is. But, for example, if I'm talking about food insecurity in the country, I'm not going to re-cue footage from the famine of the 1990s and make it seem as if that's still happening in the country. I mean, the arduous march, as the North Koreans call it, the Great Famine, was a horrific time when people were, literally eating grass and tree bark to survive. And the North Koreans openly acknowledged that was a difficult time. So we're not going to try to tell viewers that that's necessarily still happening. Certainly, if we, all we have is archived video that's now 30 years old, that wouldn't be responsible in my view. But we can certainly talk about everything that we have that's substantiated by facts, and just try to be responsible and not sensational in the way that we talk about those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask you, because there is a scene in your documentary, North Korea's Secret State, where you're having a meal at a farmhouse and they're saying this is a typical lunch, and you did ask about the food supply issue, and the gentleman you're having lunch with, he acknowledges that there were issues in the 90s and that they were eating tree bark, but that that period's over and that conditions have improved greatly. I mean, I wanted to ask you, what do you think motivates the North Koreans to actually acknowledge the period of the arduous march and then also stating that conditions have improved?
Well, I mean, it was such a horrific thing that I think you can't just pretend that people weren't dying of hunger in the streets at that time. Now, the blame for that, they would certainly not place the blame in mismanagement of the country by the leadership. In fact, the North Korean leadership has grown stronger during those periods of crisis. And I think there are a lot of possible reasons for that. I think, one, when people are struggling to survive, they don't have a whole lot of energy to think about arguing anything else. And at the same time, during these periods of crisis, they've been able to still ramp up the surveillance and and the incentive to make sure that one's own family and friends and neighbors are following the rules, because if someone is reported, the consequences could be severe, and the punishments for the person to blow the whistle could be significant. So everybody has a lot of reasons to kind of stay in line and do their part as citizens and not allow other citizens to do otherwise. And so it's really remarkable that even during these times of crisis, the North Korean the government's control and the Kim family's control has only kind of increased. I mean, and I think the feelings that people have that their leader is a genius, I think these are legitimate feelings, because from the moment they're born, I mean, they have photos of these people and these leaders in their homes. Everything that they see in the media coverage, praises the leadership. And as a result, I when you see people actually coming face to face with their leader, and they're in tears and they're jumping up and down, this is not acting for the cameras, I believe. This is seeing somebody who is actually your hero in many ways. Even if your own life is quite difficult, they're not necessarily placing the blame at the very top. They might blame local officials or think that there's other factors that are causing their lives to be difficult, but certainly they wouldn't blame the top leadership. They really do revere the Kims as some might say godlike status. Certainly just the most impressive human being that they can imagine exists in the world. And when you're in a country where the information and the propaganda is controlled so carefully, you can see why people would believe that. And even those who defect from the country say that they feel that way or felt that way and maybe still feel that way, even though they then learn other information after they leave.
True, a lot of defectors often cite economic reasons rather than political reasons for leaving. And I agree with you that does seem to be genuine hero worship of the Kims. And then going back to your point as well about, the North Korean government sort of taking advantage of these periods of crisis. I think that we also saw that happening during COVID. By all reports, there's been crackdowns on anti-socialist activity. And there was just a report of, I think for the first time ever, Kim Jong-un gathered a meeting with the neighborhood units, the Inminban, who are responsible for sort of looking after and reporting on their community and neighborhood, which I think is quite interesting.
And not to mention the border security. I mean, just at a whole new level. I think defections have dropped drastically. In fact, the only defections that were increasing during COVID were of higher level elites that were defecting from diplomatic missions around the world, and they weren't able to even go back into the country. The borders were sealed off to them for years, too. They've just reopened in the last 6 months to a year.
And so going back to a little bit of it, it's funny because there's so many, working in tourism, you get so many, obviously, trolling comments on social media, but I've also had people say to me directly, like, well, what is there to even see in North Korea? Why do you go there? And you pointed out, and it's almost like they can't even, and these are sometimes people who have been to South Korea or China or other places in Southeast Asia that are very close, and they can't, mentally, they can't even imagine North Korea even existing on the same peninsula or space as South Korea. And so you pointed out that in your documentary that because of the lack of development, though, there's still a lot of natural beauty in North Korea that's been preserved because of its underdevelopment. And I think that that's something that's overlooked by people when discussing about either visiting North Korea or even just the discussion in general.
I mean, the mountains are absolutely stunning. And one of the nicest meals I've ever had in North Korea was at a roadside, I don't know if you want to say like a rest stop or a truck stop, but it was a very unfancy eating establishment, and regular folks who were traveling were eating there, and the power went out, and they just pull out candles or flashlights, and you eat by candlelight, and it was just actually delightful. So it's we talk about how when the country's plunged into darkness, everything. Yeah, but people who've lived with this, they have ways to still enjoy their lives and kind of getting to experience that. I also experienced that when I was in Ukraine, and there were air raids, and then the lights went out, and people are eating by candlelight. I mean, it's amazing how resilient people are. That even when basic services are cut off, they find ways to kind of have relaxing and pleasant moments. And that was, like I said, one of my favorite meals, and not a fancy dinner, no flaming snail like what you guys were served in Rasson, but a simple meal by candlelight I have fond memories of that to this day.
Yeah, it's a good scene in your documentary for sure. And talking about natural beauty in North Korea, you were the first Western journalist to report from Mount Paektu. So can you tell us about that experience? And then also, I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with the relevance of Mount Paektu, but can you also give us a little bit about Paektu's significance to not just North Koreans, but Koreans in general?
Yeah, I mean, Mount Paektu is just a hugely significant location for Koreans. It also straddles the border with China, so Chinese go there as well. It's stunningly beautiful. North Korean mythology says that it's the birthplace of Kim Jong-il, the second North Korean leader. That account is disputed by Western historians who claim that Kim Jong-il was actually born in Russia, but there's a cabin by Mount Paektu that you can go and visit where they talk about the birth of Kim Jong-il by Mount Paektu, and the Paektu bloodline is part of what gives the Kim family its legitimacy to rule. The Paektu bloodline is this hugely important and historically significant bloodline on the Korean Peninsula. So it's fascinating how in a country that lacks the kind of religion that is so prevalent elsewhere in the world, this is almost their religion in a sense, the religion surrounding the lore and religion and the worship of the leaders of the ruling family. And that was deliberately created, one might say, this cult of personality. It's kind of a cliche term, but yeah, I mean, there's this mystique to Mount Paektu, and so there's a reason why the Kims and why Kim Jong-un will often be photographed there, on horseback, when he needs to make a big decision, when there's something major, because it's seen as a place where he can go and remind people of the Paektu bloodline, to go to the location where his father was, the official birth location of his father, according to the North Koreans, and a place to think and make big decisions.
Mm-hmm. And what went into you becoming the first Western journalist to cover Paektu? Is that something that you pushed for? Is that something the North Koreans asked if you wanted to do?
We've been begging for it from the beginning, and we're told no. I mean, it's not an easy trip, as you know. Although Samjeon, they're in the process of building kind of some, upgrading the facilities there. That was a hotel where you only had electricity for a few hours every day. But again, one of the favorite places I've stayed. I mean, it was just so quiet and so peaceful. But it took a lot of convincing to get permission to go there. And a real credit to our North Korean guides, because they have, the bureaucracy and the hurdles that need to be overcome. They secured access for us, and it was a Herculean effort. So really, we're begging them, and then they're going and having lots and lots of discussions to try to make it happen.
Well, what do you think the pushback was? Because Mount Paektu is a place that's been on tourist itineraries for some time.
Yeah. But it's different. It's different with journalists. Yeah, it's different with journalists. I think there's just, when you're talking about any site that is as sensitive and as important, there's just no room for error, because the people arranging the trip could get in a lot of trouble if a journalist comes and is doing something that's perceived as disrespectful. So before you're allowed to go there as a journalist and actually go with television cameras, they need to have faith that you're not going to, disrespect or desecrate in any way their sacred site. I think that's the bottom line. That just because heads could roll, if mistakes are made, and particularly with a journalist and an American news organization at the level of visibility of CNN and the platform of CNN. I mean, there's just a lot at stake for everybody.
Yep. And, it's interesting. During that scene when you were visiting Paektu in the documentary, and you were talking to the local guide at, the sort of the recreation of the cabin where Kim Jong-il was allegedly born and sent from the heavens. And she's telling the story. And then you give her some leeway. You say, so is this a legend or a myth? And she says, well, no, it's hard to define in a word, but he's so great that it cannot be a legend. And then it occurred to me that the word she's looking for likely is faith, which obviously ties into your analogy of this being essentially the state, the ideology being essentially the state religion.
Right. And yet people clearly still are, they still have a spiritual mindset, and people, whether there's a sanctioned religion or not, people probably genuinely believe that there was a heavenly kind of moment when their beloved leader was brought into the world, and that they, that symbol, they can throw their faith behind this person because the stars aligned. I mean, so it does seem that they believe in a higher power of some kind, but they may also believe that higher power has blessed their leadership with the right to rule them.
And switching gears a little bit, talking about the new resorts that have been built up in the Paektu region in Samjeon, you've been reporting North Korea since 2014, and I've been there since 2015. We've seen a lot of development, especially in Pyongyang, but not only there. We have the Wonsan Kamo Resort, which should open this year. I think in June is Kim Jong-un's goal. And you just reported on yet another residential district that's just been unveiled in Pyongyang. And we know that Kim Jong-un likes his urban development projects, tourism projects. What kind of changes have you personally seen in the country since 2014 in terms of development?
Well, I think it's remarkable how many people have smartphones and how much the intranet has grown and how much more variety and options there are for people who want to have games to play on their phone or chat, social media, but a North Korean style social media. And, it's also interesting. I mean, these smartphones are just really effective surveillance devices as well, because obviously if somebody's going to have a phone, anything that's on it can be accessed by the government, can be monitored. And I'm sure that's the case for all of us, but even to a greater extent in North Korea. So I think that there were only a handful of places when I first became an international correspondent 11 years ago where you didn't see people buried in their phones. North Korea was one, Cuba was another, and now both of those places, if you go back, people are buried in their phones. So that's a big change. The housing construction, the hospital construction, there's a lot of pretty impressive developments in North Korea that have occurred despite all of the limits on their growth because of sanctions over the nuclear program. And so, every time I have gone in, I've always been pretty impressed by what they're able to do and the resources they're able to pull together to get things done if it's a priority of the leadership. You do wonder, could those resources be better invested in other things like a more stable electricity supply and the other kind of issues that we certainly know about and document when it comes to North Korea. It's like if you're throwing all of your resources in creating this really spectacular thing, but you know that there are still areas of huge deficiency. How do you balance that? But I guess that's the age-old debate. Why do they keep building bigger and bigger missiles? I mean, it's not many countries in the world have been able to create, a massive ICBM that can reach anywhere in the world. I mean, that's an incredible achievement. In North Korea, for its small size and lack of resources and sanctions, it's been able to do that. And they also have some pretty impressive, civil projects as well. Now, whether those buildings are fully occupied, whether the elevators are going to work to get people up to the top floor, or whether they'll have to hike up the stairs, you never know. I'm not sure I'd want a penthouse in Pyongyang. I'll put it that way. I'd rather have a low floor, I think.
And therein lies, sort of the kind of the nuance of these things, because there's been a lot of people who say, oh, well, all the buildings are fake and no one actually lives in them, and when in reality people do, but they come with the caveats that you're pointing out, that there's going to be electricity issues, so the lifts aren't going to always work, so you're going to want to live on the lower floor and things like that. And backing up again to your coverage, so I wanted to ask you've covered Dennis Rodman's visits to North Korea, and I think at the time, a lot of the mainstream news outlets, the coverage, ranged from either skepticism to outright mocking him. I think when he was there with the Harlem Globetrotters, I think he was kind of unfairly asked about Kenneth Bai, which, was not really connected to what he was doing. And, because he's got a reputation for partying and drinking, so he had some pretty strong emotions about, how he was treated, and also just when I think we saw him break down and cry when Kim Jong-un and President Trump were exchanging threats. But then we had, Sarah Huckabee Sanders call Dennis Rodman, on the occasion of the first Trump-Kim summit and thank him for his contributions to making it happen. So what significance do you think his relationship with Kim Jong-un holds in the context of U.S. DPRK relations?
Well, I think it diminished over time. I think his behavior during some of the earlier trips caused Kim to distance himself, because on the last time I was there, and Dennis Rodman was there, that was also when they announced that Otto Warmbier was in a vegetative state. It was the same time that Dennis Rodman was there. So we were all kind of covering Dennis Rodman, and then lo and behold, Otto Warmbier was secretly being handed over to Joseph Yoon, who was the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea at that time. And of course, we know that days later, Otto died. And so Rodman's last visit got a lot of attention initially, but then was hugely overshadowed by Otto Warmbier's vegetative state and then death. And I was in the country when he died as well. I actually had a really bad case of food poisoning around that time, and it later came out that Otto Warmbier possibly had food poisoning, and that may have thrown up in his mouth while he was sleeping, and that may have been a contributing factor to the horrible condition that he was in, and that the North Koreans didn't disclose for over a year.
Well, I wanted to mention. I mean, we've had Dr. Joe Terwilliger on this podcast, and he, of course, served as Dennis Rodman's translator. He's fluent in Chosun Mal, the North Korean dialect, and he was Dennis Rodman's translator for his various trips. He has stated that he will only discuss what Dennis himself has revealed, but he's kind of hinted that Dennis and their team might have actually had something to do with Otto Warmbier's release on that trip. Have you seen any evidence of that?
I have not had any evidence of that. I flew back with Dennis. Dennis was seated one seat behind me. Didn't say a word to me. I did speak with his agent, but that last trip he didn't meet with Kim. As far as I know,
he didn't meet with Kim Jong-un, but he did meet with Kim Jong-nam.
Okay, yeah. So he met with the number two, but not with his good friend. I think the North Koreans politely just said that that Kim Jong-un wasn't available. And I don't know about any interaction that they've had since. So, I don't know. I don't have any details about what role he played in that, if any. I know that Joseph Yoon on the U.S. side was there and that he was the one having the direct discussions. And I don't believe that Dennis Rodman was privy to those or involved in those, at least not as far as I'm aware.
Okay. Yeah, understood. So talking about other significant coverage during, I think it was your last visit in 2018 for the destruction of the Punggye-ri nuclear test site? Yes, that was the last.
Hey. That was the last time. Gosh, time has flown by.
You were one of 12 foreign correspondents covering that, correct?
I don't. You probably know better than me how many, but there weren't that many of us.
That was after the travel ban went into effect. So the U.S. State Department imposed a travel ban restricting U.S. citizens from using their U.S. passport to travel to North Korea, which went into effect on September 1st, 2017. And of course, you can apply for a special passport or permission to visit through the U.S. State Department, but it has to be in the national interest. So are you able to speak to that process and then also the larger experience of covering the destruction of the nuclear test site?
Yeah, we didn't have a problem getting the special passports issued to go. I still have them. I still have my North Korean multi-entry visa. I believe I was the only American at that time anyway that had a multi-entry visa at one point. When we were going in a lot in 2017. So that was I have that framed actually here in my office. And I have the special passports, these thin little passports that they issue just for this purpose of entering North Korea. This is more for the U.S. side. The North Koreans didn't care. I think you could probably give them a normal passport and it would be fine with them. The ban is on the U.S. side, not on the North Korean side. Other than you, one of the only Americans to go in at all lately was that U.S. soldier that ran across the DMZ, that was in a tour group and ran into North Korea, and they got him expelled really quickly, actually. I think faster than a lot of people expected in a few months. But anyway, back to the trip in 2018. We stayed in Wonsan, so that was quite something. I remember when Kim Jong-un came in, he flew his own plane in to inspect the hotels that were under construction that we talked about earlier, and they had everybody come inside the hotel and shut the blinds So we weren't able to actually see Kim's plane. They basically just shut down the whole area, which I thought was interesting. That was a vivid memory I have. Then, getting on the train, going on this really interesting train journey where the windows were also basically they were put boards over the windows and screwed them shut, so we couldn't take any pictures out of the windows of the places we passed by on the train. But the train itself was quite something. I think we were on a luxury version of a North Korean train, the kind of train that maybe, senior military officials would travel on, a sleeping car and a dining car and all of that. So that was fascinating. And then the nuclear test site itself. I just remember it being, this is a place that we've talked about so much, and it to me, it kind of looked like a rustic campsite in terms of the buildings and then the tunnel entrances where they were doing the tests. It was all very rustic. We weren't allowed to take, any sort of radiation detectors with us. So, passing by these villages that were right by the site and that were growing produce, that was interesting. I think people probably lived there, but we didn't see anybody. They were probably told to go inside when we were driving past. And then seeing the demolition itself, there was a lot of skepticism even at that time that the demolition was as permanent as the North Koreans were claiming, because it just looked like they kind of blew up the entrances to the tunnels, and we didn't know how far back, would they be able to dig out the entrance pretty quickly, build a new tunnel pretty quickly. There was skepticism then and now, and it seems as if satellite imagery has kind of backed up the thought that Punggye-ri is now basically could be activated again if need be. It's no longer it's not irreparably destroyed as the North Koreans claimed at that time. So it was fascinating. They certainly knew how to put on a show to just blow up these buildings. I think the people that worked at Punggye-ri probably were feeling pretty distraught about all of their years of hard work, being blown up with international cameras rolling. I'd be pretty ticked off if that was my place of employment and I put a lot of effort into it and then it was getting blown up. But that was what they felt was needed to do to send a message to the international community, and particularly President Trump, that they were serious about the prospect of denuclearization at that time. But clearly, I think Punggye-ri probably is back in operation now. So whatever we saw there was able to be reversed, although we haven't been back to verify it ourselves.
Well, you mentioned that it was during, pretty much right after the destruction of the site, the news came in that talks had broke down during the summit.
I think it was even ahead. It was like a month before Singapore. So initially, I think they were going to call off Singapore, but then they were able to salvage it in the end.
That's right. Okay. What was the reaction though when they had initially called off the summit?
Yeah, we were on the train. I remember trying to do phone reports from the train on their way to the nuclear site, and it was such an uncertain time. After it was like nobody really knew what to expect on the North Korean side or the U.S. side, and it was just. I think everybody was pretty confused and not sure what was going to happen. And in the end, they were able to salvage it and move forward with the meeting. It was a really fascinating time to be there, honestly.
And I know we've got to kind of move along, and you've got work to do today because there's other developing news. But I just have just a few more questions for you. You've mentioned that. Your ultimate goal, and that's the thing that you've been working towards, is an interview with Marshal Kim Jong-un. If you were to be granted that interview, do you know what you would ask him?
Oh gosh, so much. This is, I think probably any journalist who's covered North Korea would love to have the opportunity to sit down with, who the North Koreans call their great marshal. And I've been following him for over 10 years, very intensively. He and I are of similar age as well. And to be born into that family and to be thrust into that job at such a young age, and to navigate such complicated internal political waters. Obviously, we know, his uncle. He ordered the execution of his uncle for treason and corruption, which shocked a lot of people because they just initially they were thinking that because he was so young that he was going to be either he could be manipulated easily or overthrown easily, and he's certainly proven himself to be a kind of a masterful operator in dealing with his own domestic situation and consolidating power domestically, but also the way that he's presented himself globally and the way he's gone to these meetings with world leaders like Xi Jinping, like Donald Trump, well prepared by all accounts, holding his own. I think his sister, Kim Yo-jong, has done, the way that she's made sure that the optics surrounding Kim Jong-un, and not just propaganda at home, but if you looked at when Kim went to Singapore, for example, and President Trump, who I think kind of arrived at the last minute, was pretty jet lagged. At the same time, Kim Jong-un was out getting a tour of the streets of Singapore. And I mean, the pictures showed these crowds that were lining the streets cheering for him. And he was visiting all these landmarks and kind of learning about Singapore. I mean, I was just struck by how masterful he and his team were at making the most of that moment that they were in the global spotlight. So, I have tons of things I'd love to ask him about. I'd love to know what his conversations were like with President Trump when President Trump was showing him that video talking about, developing condos in Wonsan on the, in the place where they've, launched artillery from. And I mean, I never go into interviews with pre-scripted questions, although I'm sure the North Koreans would probably insist on that in any sort of interview with their leader. But I just like to have a conversation. And, what's it like to be so young and to have that job and to be in that family and to be part of this? And, what are his aspirations for the country? I mean, there's so many things I'd be fascinated to talk to him about. And I'd love to have that opportunity someday. Don't know if I will. Don't know if he's ever going to sit down and give an interview in that way, but I would love to be considered if they're wanting to do that.
Okay, so I want to, we talked about, these sort of scripted moments during your coverage, and I think you've done a really good job of sort of, and I try to do the same, kind of giving the North Koreans the benefit of the doubt, and that there's not really a need to confront them at the Fatherland Liberation War Museum about who really started the Korean War. If you go to the Songdo-won Children's Camp, there's not really, a need to ask the question, well, does every child in North Korea have this opportunity? Because we know that the answer is likely no.
Well, it's definitely no. But does every child in other countries have? I mean, is it equal for every child in capitalist countries? Of course not. You come if you're in a capital city, if you're in a major area, if you come from money or influence or power, the deck is stacked in your favor, and that's the case everywhere. So we should always be critical and report critically about these things, but we also need to be fair and put things in the proper context.
Definitely, and I want to ask you, but we're used to these scripted moments, but people who do travel to the country often have some sort of unscripted moments, and I wanted to ask you if you had a favorite unscripted moment.
Do you remember that scene in the documentary where I was chatting with a woman who's a farmer, and I asked her, if she could, because their travel is restricted even inside North Korea. So I don't believe she had ever even been to Pyongyang, if I recall correctly. But I asked her, if she could go somewhere outside of North Korea, where would she most want to visit? And she gave an answer that shocked me. She said she would like to visit the United States. And no one has ever said that to me in North Korea, that they would actually like to visit the United States. And I think that was a pretty honest answer, which of course I followed up with, well, why? And then she immediately switched into, well, I'd like to go there so I can burn and destroy their land and, ask them why they're oppressing us. And then she gave a very patriotic kind of follow-up, which I think, that was a pretty shrewd of her, considering that her answers were being recorded and written down, and she was going to get a talking to afterwards about the conversation. So I think she salvaged it. But I did think that was a pretty genuine answer, that she was curious about visiting the U.S., even then when the follow-up question got a lot of political rhetoric. So that was really pretty, I really liked her. I was impressed by this woman, this farmer who spoke so kind of powerfully and eloquently, but also kind of candidly. That's a real gift that you don't get very often when you're talking to North Koreans, because there's a lot at stake for them, and what they say is obviously there could be huge repercussions if they say what they would consider to be the wrong thing. Kind of like going to any major corporation where you have to talk nicely about the boss, and if you don't, there'd be consequences. I mean, I've kind of compared the culture, in terms of having to praise the leader. I mean, it's, most people listening to this have probably worked at a company where you have to praise your leader, right? So it's a similar thing, although obviously the penalties for speaking against the leader are much more severe in a place like North Korea, because you get a lot more than fired if you say the wrong thing.
Yep. Okay, and that brings me to my final question. What message do you hope your reporting conveys to audiences about the complexities of North Korea and its people? And I think we have touched upon all these, so I'm not looking for a super long answer, unless, of course, you want to give one.
Well, I hope people come away with the fact that North Koreans are very resilient and impressive and resourceful people. The things that they've achieved, both on the ground in terms of everyday life and the way that they're able to live their lives, and also the things that they've achieved as a nation, I think people should look at them with a measure of respect for all that they've accomplished. I think if the playing field were leveled out and there weren't the sanctions and restrictions on the country, they'd be quite a force, economically and otherwise. I mean, they're already a military force despite all of the obstacles. So, and the people are kind, normal people, worthy of, and deserving of the same basic things that all of us around the world want. And whether or not we agree with the government that they live in, there's certainly a lot of discussion that should be had about the way that North Koreans live and the restrictions on their lives. We should just always have respect and compassion for the people themselves and all the things that they've been able to achieve despite very difficult circumstances.
Absolutely. Okay. And well, listen, like I said, I know you've got a news cycle to keep up with, so I don't want to keep you much longer. And I feel like we could go on all afternoon, and I look forward, maybe we'll have a part two, especially as I know we're both, anxiously watching and waiting for further developments, especially in the field of North Korea tourism. And actually, that I did want to actually ask you, and I know I said this was the last question, but I wanted to ask you what role you think tourism plays in, sort of breaking down barriers and helping with the understanding for the outside world with North Korea, and vice versa, helping North Korea understand the motivations of the outside world and foreigners.
I think any interaction on a person-to-person basis is beneficial. Anytime that you, Justin, can go in there and maybe change someone's perception of America and Americans, there's a benefit there. And so I hope that it continues. I hope that North Korea continues to crack open the door and to allow not just tourism, but NGOs and diplomatic missions to reopen, because I think it's, for the sake of the nation, for the sake of its people, more interaction with the world, I think is beneficial always. So let's just hope that things will continue to open up, and, sunlight and sunshine is always the best. When you're shining it in places that are hidden off from the world, like North Korea has been. I mean, they've arguably are coming out of their period of being the most isolated that they may have ever been. And so the more that the rest of the world can get back in there and to try to do some good, I think is important, and for the people there.
I couldn't agree more. Well, Will, thank you very much for being on the Young Pioneer podcast.
Thank you, Justin. Take care.